Welcome back, guys, to Wrong Turn Horror. In today's episode, I'm sharing 10 terrifying lighthouse disappearances nobody can explain. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new horror story. Now, let's step into the cold, lonely world of lighthouses, where the sea swallows ships, and sometimes it swallows the men who guard its shores. The Vanishing Keepers of Flannan Isles, Scotland, 1900. The North Atlantic has always been a graveyard for sailors. Its waters are unforgiving, its storms violent and sudden, and its coast jagged with black rocks that split ships like kindling. That's why lighthouses were built, to stand like guardians against the endless fury of the sea. But sometimes, the guardians themselves vanish. In the winter of 1900, three men, Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, and Donald MacArthur, were stationed at the Flannan Isles Lighthouse, a lonely tower that stood above the cliffs of Moor, Scotland. The lighthouse was new, only a year in operation, and it was already known as a brutal post. The waves roared against the cliffs below, and the men lived in constant isolation, with nothing but wind and gulls for company. Their only contact with the outside world came once every few weeks, when the relief vessel Hesperus would bring supplies and fresh crew. But on December 15th, 1900, something went wrong. The passing steamer Archdor reported the light was dark, completely extinguished. That was unheard of. The Flannan Light was one of the most critical beacons on that treacherous stretch of sea. For it to go dark meant something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. Still, storms raged for days, delaying the Hesperus. When the relief crew finally reached the island on December 26th, the scene that greeted them was straight out of a nightmare. The men tied their boat to the landing platform and climbed the steep, wet steps cut into the rock. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The keepers' quarters were neat and tidy, the beds made, the kitchen in order. A chair was overturned by the table, as if someone had risen suddenly. The clock on the wall had stopped. But the strangest thing was this. The lighthouse was completely empty. Not a single man remained. The logbook was still on the desk, and its last entries made the search party's skin crawl. One entry read, "Severe winds, the likes of which I have never seen before in 20 years. Sea is raging, men praying." The next entry was even stranger. "Storm ended. Sea calm. God is over all." That was the final line, written in a shaky hand. There were no bodies, no signs of a struggle, no explanation. Two of the keepers' oilskin coats were missing, but the third was still hanging on the peg. That meant at least one of them had gone outside in the storm without proper protection, a deadly mistake. The relief team scoured the island. They found twisted iron railings near the west landing, bent by the force of the sea. A supply box, usually chained down, had been ripped free. The grass was torn as if waves had surged far higher than anyone thought possible. The conclusion given in the official report was simple. The men had gone out to secure the equipment during the storm. One of them was swept away by a massive wave. The others, in a desperate attempt to save him, were also dragged into the sea. But if that was the case, why was the final log entry written in calm, almost peaceful language? Why did one man leave without his coat? And why did locals whisper of something darker? For years afterward, sailors avoided the Flannan Isles. They said the island was cursed, that it had always been a place of strange happenings. Fishermen claimed they saw lights moving along the cliffs where no man should be. Some swore they heard voices calling in the wind, voices of men long drowned. And here's where the story grows more disturbing. When the Hesperus returned with new keepers to take over the lighthouse, those men reported something they never wrote in the official logs. At night, they heard footsteps pacing the empty tower, even when they were alone. One swore he saw three figures standing by the edge of the cliff, staring out at the sea, before vanishing like mist. The locals of the Outer Hebrides already had their own legends about the island. They believed it was inhabited by spirits, the little men of the sea. Some claimed these were fairy-like creatures. Others said they were the restless souls of sailors lost to the waves. The island's Gaelic name, Moor, was often whispered with dread, for it was said that the land belonged not to men, but to the sea itself. Could the keepers have fallen victim to something beyond human understanding? One theory was that they had gone mad. Isolation has a way of breaking men. Some speculated that the storm, the endless roar of the waves, and the isolation drove one of them into a fit of rage. Perhaps there was a fight, a murder-suicide, and the sea carried away the evidence. But if that were true, why was there no blood, no broken furniture, no sign of struggle in the quarters? Another theory suggested something more supernatural. The final log entry, "God is over all," felt more like a prayer than a record. Was it possible the men saw something so terrifying they could not explain it? In the years since, paranormal investigators who visited the island reported overwhelming feelings of dread. Compasses spun erratically. Radios picked up static filled with voices, faint and unintelligible. One group swore they heard a man screaming for help far below the cliffs, but when they searched, the rocks were empty. The most chilling detail came decades later, when a storm again battered the lighthouse. The keeper at the time radioed in a frantic report. "The sea is wrong. The waves are not natural. They rise when there is no wind." The transmission cut out. The keeper was found unharmed the next morning, but his hair had turned white overnight. He never spoke of what he saw again. Today, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse is automated. No human lives there anymore. The tower stands, its beam sweeping across the waters, but the rooms inside remain empty. Empty, but not silent. Sailors still whisper of strange lights on the island, and of voices carried by the wind. And sometimes, when the weather turns violent, they swear they see 3 shadowy figures moving along the cliffs, lanterns in hand, forever searching for a way home. The sea took them, some say. Others believe something else called them, something ancient that waits just beyond the breakers. And so, the mystery of the vanished keepers remains unsolved. Over a century later, no bodies have ever been found. No one knows what truly happened on that storm-ravaged night. All that's left are unanswered questions and the haunting sense that the ocean does not always give back what it takes. The Eilean Mor Lighthouse Mystery, Outer Hebrides, Scotland. The Flannan Isles, remote, windswept, and uninhabited. At the heart of these islands stands the lighthouse on Eilean Mor, its white stone walls beaten by storms and salt. Sailors knew this place well, and not with fondness. The sea here has always been cruel, unpredictable, and many whispered it was cursed long before men ever tried to tame it with a tower of light. You already know about the 3 men who vanished here in 1900. But what most don't know is that the mystery didn't end when their bodies were claimed by the sea, or something far worse. The island itself seemed to hold on to their presence, twisting it into something unnatural. Arrival of the relief crew. Weeks after the tragedy, once the news spread across Scotland, another crew was reluctantly assigned to take over the Flannan Isles Lighthouse. These men had heard the stories. They knew about the missing keepers. Still, duty was duty. The sea didn't forgive empty lights, and the shipping lanes were too dangerous to leave unwatched. When the new men set foot on the island, they described an immediate heaviness. Not just the kind that storms bring, but something else, something that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. The air seemed thick, as though it carried voices too faint to hear. They entered the lighthouse, and though it was cleaned and restored, it still felt wrong. The beds were made, the lanterns polished, but the silence was unbearable. One keeper wrote in his private journal, "The air here is heavy. I hear the waves below, yet I swear I hear men walking in the tower when we are all together." Strange lights on the cliffs. Within their first week, the new crew began to see things. At night, when the fog rolled in and the sea howled against the cliffs, strange lantern lights appeared on the edges of the island. Not ships, not stars. These were bobbing, human-sized lights, drifting along the cliffs where no man could walk safely in such darkness. One night, a keeper named Andrew swore he saw 3 lights together, side by side, moving as though men were patrolling. He called to the others, and when they looked, the lights flickered and vanished all at once. Andrew became obsessed. Every night, he climbed the tower to watch. He swore those are the lost keepers, still tending to their duties, even in death. His journal became erratic, filled with drawings of 3 figures, always standing together, always near the sea. Voices in the wind. Then came the voices. At first, faint murmurs carried by the gales. One man thought he heard someone whisper his name. Another claimed he heard crying from below the cliffs. They searched, of course, but the island was barren. No one was there but them. On the 3rd week, Andrew woke the others in the middle of the night, pale as a corpse. He said he'd heard knocking inside the walls. Slow, deliberate knocks, moving up the stairs, as if someone unseen was climbing toward the lantern room. The men laughed it off, tried to convince themselves it was the wind shaking the ironwork. But then they heard it too. Knock, 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 all the way up the spiral staircase. They grabbed their lamps, but when they opened the lantern room door, the space was empty. Just a great glass light, turning silently. But the knocking never returned, at least not that night. The screams below. Weeks later, while repairing equipment near the west landing, one of the men froze. From below the cliffs came the sound of screaming. Human screams. Long, drawn-out wails that echoed against the rocks. They ran to the edge, staring down into the foam. The sea was violent, but there were no bodies, no wreckage. Nothing but waves and black water. Yet the screams continued, rising and falling like men drowning just beneath the surface. The keepers staggered back, shaken. That night none of them slept. And as the wind howled, they all admitted they had heard the same thing. Men screaming in the sea. The Diary of Fear. Andrew's journal became the only surviving record of what happened on Eilean Moor after the tragedy. His entries grew more frantic. We hear them in the wind. I see them with lanterns, pacing the cliffs. The knocking is closer. It waits outside the door. The last entry was short, written with a shaky hand. They want us to join them. The keeper who broke. One night, Andrew vanished. His boots were found near the cliff's edge, neatly placed side by side, as though he had taken them off before stepping into the darkness. No body was ever recovered. The remaining keepers radioed the mainland, begging for an early relief. But the sea was too violent, and the ship couldn't come for another week. During that week, the surviving men refused to sleep alone. They barricaded the doors, prayed loudly, and kept the light burning at all costs. But the noises grew worse. Some nights it sounded like footsteps circling the tower endlessly. Other times it was faint laughter echoing from the cliffs. Once, one of the men swore he saw a face staring through the glass window of the lantern room, though they were hundreds of feet above the ground. The final night. By the time the relief ship finally arrived, the lighthouse was still running, but the men were broken. Pale, trembling, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights. They refused to speak of what they had experienced. They left the island and never returned. But in private, one of them revealed what he saw on their final night. He said he woke in the dark hours, drawn to the window. Below, on the cliffs, he saw 3 men, soaked, pale, and gaunt, each holding a lantern. Their faces were unmistakable. They were the missing keepers. The figures looked up at him with empty eyes, then turned and walked slowly into the sea. Their lanterns vanished beneath the waves, and the night grew silent. Legacy of Fear. After that, the lighthouse was branded cursed. Every new keeper station there reported strange happenings. Doors slamming without wind. Tools moved from their places. Voices whispering names in the dead of night. Some lasted months before begging for transfer. Others left within days, unable to endure the oppressive presence of something unseen. By the 1970s, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse was fully automated, no longer requiring men to live there. To this day, it stands alone, its beams sweeping across the waves. No human footsteps echo within its stone halls anymore. But fishermen who pass near the island still report strange sights. Lights drifting across the cliffs. Figures standing in the lantern room, though the tower is unmanned. And always, when storms rise, they claim to hear the faint cries of men carried on the wind. Some say it's the ghosts of the lost keepers. Others whisper it is the sea itself, hungering, luring more souls to its depths. The Eilean Mor Lighthouse remains one of the most haunted places in the world. It was built to guide sailors to safety, yet it seems to do the opposite. Its light has become a beacon not just for ships, but for spirits. And if you ever find yourself near the Flannan Isles on a stormy night, and you hear your name whispered on the wind, do not answer, because some voices should never be answered. The St. Augustine Lighthouse Tragedy, Florida, 1870s. Florida's coastline has always been treacherous. Shallow waters, shifting sandbars, and unpredictable storms made it a graveyard for countless ships. That's why the St. Augustine Lighthouse was built, a black and white spiral tower rising above the trees, meant to keep sailors alive. But the lighthouse itself became a place of tragedy, and the spirits of those who died there never left. The beginning of the curse. It was the 1870s. Construction had begun on the new lighthouse, meant to replace the old Spanish watchtower that had crumbled into the sea. Workers labored day and night under the blistering Florida sun. Among them was Hezekiah Pitt, the superintendent of construction. He lived on site with his family, including his 4 children. The Pitt girls, Mary, Eliza, and little Carrie, were playful, curious, and often underfoot. They loved exploring the construction site, fascinated by the giant carts used to haul materials down the hill to the water. One hot summer afternoon, the girls climbed into one of these carts, a heavy wooden wagon balanced on rails, designed to carry supplies down to the waterline. They squealed with laughter as they pushed off, riding it like a carnival ride. The cart rattled down the slope, faster and faster. But something went wrong. The brakes failed. The cart careened out of control, racing down the hill, past the shouts of workers who could only watch in horror. It hit the end of the tracks and launched into the water. The wagon flipped, trapping the girls underneath. By the time the men reached them, it was too late. 2 of the girls, Mary and Eliza, were drowned. Only Carrie survived, pulled from the wreckage, coughing and sobbing. The site fell silent after that. Workers claimed the air itself changed, heavy with sorrow. Some refused to continue, whispering that the land had taken blood and would take more. Shadows in the tower. When the lighthouse was finally completed in 1874, it stood as a triumph of engineering. But the families who moved in quickly realized they were not alone. The new keepers began reporting strange happenings. At night, they heard the sound of children's laughter echoing up the spiral staircase. Doors creaked open on their own. Footsteps padded across the stone floors, light and quick like a child running. One keeper's wife swore she saw a little girl in a white dress at the top of the stairs. She rushed up, terrified that one of her children was playing too close to the lantern. But when she reached the landing, the girl was gone. The room was empty. Others claimed to see small, wet footprints on the stairs, appearing as though someone had just climbed out of the sea and walked inside. The prints would vanish halfway up, leaving nothing but silence. The keeper's wife. One of the most chilling accounts came from a later keeper's wife, who lived in a house near the base of the tower. One evening she was sewing by lamplight when she heard giggles in the hallway. She assumed her children were awake, sneaking around. Back to bed, she called without looking up. The giggling continued. Annoyed, she stood and opened the door. The hallway was empty. At the far end, just for a moment, she swore she saw 2 little girls in dresses, dripping with seawater, holding hands. They smiled at her, then vanished into the dark. The woman never slept in that house again. The tragedy repeats. The lighthouse seemed cursed to repeat tragedy. In 1889, the head keeper, William Russell, fell ill and died in the keeper's house. Later, another keeper, Joseph Andrew, fell to his death while painting the tower, his body broken on the ground below. Each death added another layer to the growing whispers that the lighthouse was haunted. Locals avoided it after dark. Sailors claimed they could see figures moving in the lantern room when no keeper was assigned. And always there were the children. Workers reported hearing the sound of girls playing near the base of the tower, singing old folk songs. Some swore they saw a cart, like the construction wagon, rolling by itself, creaking as though invisible hands pushed it along. Modern sightings. Even today, The St. Augustine Lighthouse is infamous for its hauntings. Visitors on ghost tours often report seeing shadowy figures darting around the spiral staircase. Some describe being tugged by invisible hands, as though children were pulling at their clothes. Security guards have heard giggling in the empty tower at night. Others claim to see a girl in a white dress peeking from the stairwell before vanishing. One tourist swore he caught a photograph of two young girls on the landing, their faces pale and dripping with water, though no children were present. The unfinished lullaby. One of the eeriest stories comes from a keeper in the mid-20th century. Alone in the tower, he heard humming, a lullaby, faint and sad. He climbed the stairs, following the sound, lantern in hand. At the very top, he froze. There, sitting on the final step, were two girls. Their dresses clung wet to their skin. Their eyes were dark, empty pools. They hummed the lullaby softly, staring straight at him. The keeper dropped his lamp. The flame extinguished, plunging him into darkness. By the time he scrambled back with another lantern, the girls were gone. He resigned the next day. The curse of the land. Some historians believe the lighthouse was doomed from the beginning. The land beneath it was said to be sacred to the Timucua tribe long before Europeans arrived. Legend claims the spirits of the land demand offerings, and the tragedy of the Piti girls was the first of many sacrifices. Whether curse or coincidence, the fact remains, the St. Augustine Lighthouse has claimed more lives than any other in America, and those who died seem unwilling to leave. Today, the St. Augustine Lighthouse still stands, its spiral stripes a landmark of Florida's coast. It draws thousands of tourists every year, many coming not just for the history, but for the hauntings. And if you're brave enough to climb its 219 steps, you may hear it too, the giggle of a child echoing in the stairwell, the slap of bare feet on stone, the whisper of a lullaby that should never be sung again. And if you look up to the lantern room at night, you might see two little girls holding hands, watching you with hollow eyes. They drowned in the sea more than a century ago, but they're still waiting, still playing in the shadows of the tower that took them. Some tragedies never end. The Lighthouse of Tillamook Rock, Oregon, 1880s. Off the wild coast of Oregon, about a mile from land, there sits a jagged black rock that juts out of the Pacific Ocean like the broken tooth of some ancient beast. The native peoples who lived along that coast had always feared it. They called it cursed, a place where restless spirits lingered. But in the 1880s, the U.S. government decided that this was where they would build a lighthouse. Sailors needed a beacon, something to warn them away from the violent shoals and reefs that had already claimed countless ships. It was meant to be a place of safety. Instead, it became one of the most infamous lighthouses in American history. A place so cursed that keepers came to call it Terrible Tilly. Building on the cursed rock, construction of the lighthouse began in 1879, and from the very beginning, it seemed doomed. The rock was almost impossible to reach. Workers had to climb up its slick, vertical face as waves crashed below, threatening to rip them off at any moment. Before they even laid the first stone, tragedy struck. A supply boat carrying materials was caught in a sudden storm and smashed against the rocks. All aboard were killed, their bodies dashed against the cliffs. The workers took this as a bad omen. Some refused to continue. Others whispered that the rock had claimed its first payment in blood. But the government pressed on. Work continued through gales and accidents, and finally, in 1881, the Tillamook Rock Lighthouse was completed. It stood 62 feet tall, its lantern meant to shine 18 miles out to sea. Yet the keepers soon discovered they were prisoners in a nightmare. Life on Terrible Tilly. Isolation was absolute. Once you were on the rock, you were cut off from the world. Weeks passed without supply boats, especially in winter, when the seas were too violent to approach. The keepers described the sound of waves smashing against the rock as deafening, like cannon fire that never stopped. Storms hurled boulders the size of wagons against the walls. Windows shattered, doors bent on their hinges. The men patched and repaired constantly, but the ocean always found a way in. Worse still was the sense that they were not alone. keepers began reporting strange noises, knocks against the walls in the middle of calm nights, whispers carried on the wind that didn't sound like the sea. One wrote in his journal, "There is something in the waves. It watches us from below. Sometimes I see a face in the foam, but when I look again, it is gone." The coffin on the rock. The most infamous incident came only a few years after the lighthouse opened. In January of 1888, a steamer named Lupatia wrecked near Tillamook Rock during a violent storm. All 16 crew members were lost. The keepers watched helplessly from the tower as the ship broke apart, unable to launch a rescue boat in the raging sea. The next morning, as the storm cleared, the keepers discovered something horrifying. A coffin, yes, a coffin, had been hurled onto the rock by the waves. Inside lay the body of a drowned sailor, preserved by the cold. The men dragged the coffin inside, not knowing what else to do. That night, the keepers claimed they heard footsteps pacing the tower. The body was buried on shore days later, but from that moment on, the lighthouse was never the same. One keeper later wrote, "Since the coffin came, I hear voices in the spray. They call my name. The sea is alive, and it wants us. Madness on the rock. Life on Tilly broke men. Isolation gnawed at them, and the relentless storms battered not only the tower but their minds." One winter, a keeper named Charles was left alone when his partner fell ill and had to be evacuated. For weeks, Charles tended the light by himself. When the relief boat finally reached him, they found him raving, his journal filled with frantic drawings of waves shaped like monstrous hands reaching for the tower. He never worked again. Another keeper supposedly walked out onto the cliffs during a storm, shouting at the sea as if arguing with it. He never came back. His body was never recovered. The logbook of terror. Surviving logs from Tillamook Rock are filled with unsettling entries. Some read like desperate prayers. The sea is wrong. It rises when there is no wind. I see eyes in the water. The dead are climbing the rocks. One final entry from a keeper named Samuel remains the most chilling. The sea is calling me home. Samuel vanished that same night. The others swore they had locked the door, yet his bed was empty. The waves were calm. No boat had come. He was simply gone, abandoned to the sea. By the 1950s, technology had advanced enough that Tillamook Rock Lighthouse was no longer needed. It was automated and then permanently shut down. The last keepers left gladly, never to return. But the story didn't end there. The abandoned lighthouse was later purchased by a private company and, disturbingly, turned into a columbarium, a place to store cremated remains. Families paid to have urns placed inside, thinking it would be a peaceful resting place. But storms battered the structure relentlessly. Waves crashed through shattered windows. Some urns were destroyed, their ashes washed out to sea. Locals whispered that this only added more restless spirits to the already cursed rock. Today, terrible Tilly sits crumbling, abandoned and forbidden to visitors. Seabirds circle overhead, and waves crash endlessly against its black cliffs. The haunting of terrible Tilly. Fishermen who pass by at night swear they see lights flickering in the tower, even though it has been dark for decades. Some claim they hear the mournful toll of a bell that hasn't rung in years. Others say they see figures standing on the cliffs, staring out to sea. And there are still stories of the coffin. Visitors who dared land on the rock reported hearing dragging sounds, as if with scraping against stone, even though nothing was there. Some even claimed they smelled salt water and decay inside the empty tower. The sea claimed many lives around Tillamook Rock, and it seems determined to never release them. The Tillamook Rock Lighthouse was built to protect sailors. Instead, it became a monument to tragedy and madness. Its keepers called it Terrible Tilly for good reason. A coffin brought death to its doorstep. Isolation drove men to insanity. And the sea itself seemed alive, reaching for the souls of those trapped on its cursed rock. Now it stands alone, battered by storms, a ruin on the horizon. But if you listen closely on stormy nights, you might hear the faint toll of a bell or the desperate cries of men drowned long ago. And if you ever find yourself staring at Tillamook Rock from the shore, ask yourself this. Is it the waves crashing that you hear, or something inside the tower, waiting to be heard? Some places were never meant for the living. The ghost of Seguin Island Lighthouse, Maine, 1800s. Off the coast of Maine lies a small island battered by fog, storms, and the endless crash of the Atlantic. It is called Seguin Island, a lonely patch of rock and grass that has stood for centuries as both a warning and a curse. Atop its cliffs stands one of the oldest lighthouses in the state, built in 1795. The beacon was meant to save sailors from the treacherous shoals that lurk beneath the gray waves. But the light of Seguin Island came at a cost. The men and women who lived here paid it in blood, madness, and silence. This is the story of the haunting of Seguin Island, a story of music that never stops, and of a keeper who lost everything to the sea. The isolation of the keepers. Life on Seguin was brutal. The island was small, barely 64 acres, and the keepers and their families were trapped there, cut off from the mainland for weeks at a time. Supplies came only when the weather allowed. Winters were long and bitter, summers fog-choked and damp. For many, the loneliness was too much. Keepers' wives often spoke of hearing strange whispers in the fog, or of the constant moaning of the wind that never let them sleep. Some swore that shadows moved just beyond the lantern light at night. One woman wrote in a letter to her sister, "This place feels wrong. The sea watches us. Even the silence here is louder than any city. My husband is changing. His eyes are hollow." But one story, above all, has kept Seguin Island in the grip of legend. The keeper and his wife. In the mid-1800s, a keeper was assigned to Seguin Lighthouse with his young wife. They were newly married, and she came willingly, eager to begin their life together. But she soon discovered that Seguin was no paradise. The days dragged on endlessly. The foghorn groaned without pause, and the isolation gnawed at her mind. To ease her loneliness, the keeper ordered a piano from the mainland, a rare and expensive treasure for such a remote place. When it arrived, his wife was overjoyed. At first, she played beautiful songs that drifted across the island, carrying faintly over the waves. The music seemed to breathe life into the lifeless rock. But as the months dragged on, she learned only a single tune. And that one tune was played again and again, day after day, hour after hour. The same melody, echoing through the lighthouse. The keeper begged her to stop, but she refused. It was the only thing that kept her sane. And so the piano played, over and over, until the notes themselves seemed to drive the keeper into madness. The murder in the lighthouse. One stormy night, the tune played again, filling the stone tower with its endless repetition. The keeper snapped. He grabbed an axe, stormed into the parlor, and with one violent swing, ended the music and his wife's life. The legend says he then destroyed the piano with the same axe, smashing it to splinters until the island was finally silent. But silence brought no peace. The next morning, the keeper walked to the cliffs. He stood for a long time, staring at the waves below. Then, without a word, he stepped forward. His body was never recovered. The haunting begins. From that day on, Seguin Island was never the same. Keepers who came after reported hearing faint music drifting through the fog. The tune was always the same, haunting, repetitive, and played on a piano that no longer existed. Some claimed the notes came from the parlor where the piano once stood. Others swore they heard it out at sea, as if the waves themselves were carrying the melody. A few even reported seeing a pale woman sitting at a phantom piano, her fingers moving gracefully across invisible keys. Her face was sorrowful, but her eyes were empty. The keeper's ghost. But the wife is not the only ghost of Seguin. Many keepers have reported the presence of the axe-wielding husband. He is seen wandering the tower at night, his boots echoing on the spiral stairs. Some say he appears behind them as they tend the lantern, his face twisted with rage. One keeper in the 1930s wrote in his logbook, "I heard the sound of boots behind me. When I turned, there was a man with an axe. He was soaked to the bone, seaweed tangled in his hair. When I blinked, he was gone." Another claimed to have been shoved while climbing the stairs, nearly falling to his death. He swore a voice whispered in his ear, "Play the song." Other deaths on Seguin. Seguin's cursed history does not end with the piano. Workers building the first tower in the 1790s died in accidents when scaffolding collapsed. One fell into the sea and was never recovered. His screams, they say, can still be heard on stormy nights. In the 1800s, a child of a keeper died from illness on the island. Her small grave still rests on Seguin today. Visitors claim they hear a child's laughter in the fog, followed by sudden silence. And during the Civil War, a supply boat capsized near the island, drowning several men. Some nights, their lanterns are seen bobbing in the water, though no boats are there. The phantom piano. The most enduring mystery remains the phantom piano music. Visitors to this day report hearing it. In the 1950s, a Coast Guard keeper swore he heard the same song every night for a week. When he mentioned it to a local fisherman, the man grew pale. "That tune's been played here for 100 years, the fisherman said, and it will be for 100 more. Tourists who visit the island museum sometimes hear it too. A few have captured faint notes on audio recordings. Skeptics dismiss it as the wind through the cracks of the old tower. But believers know better. The piano was smashed long ago, and yet the song never ended. Abandonment. Seguin Island Lighthouse was automated in 1985. The last keepers left, and the island was left to silence. But the silence was never real. Visitors still report the music. Some claim to see a woman standing at the window of the tower, her pale face watching them as they approach. Others describe a shadowy figure pacing the cliffs with an axe in his hand, and many leave quickly, unwilling to spend the night. The lighthouse at Seguin Island was meant to guide sailors to safety. Instead, it became a prison of madness, murder, and eternal sorrow. A wife who played her piano too long, a husband who couldn't bear the song, blood spilled in the lantern's glow, and a melody that will not die. So if you ever visit Seguin Island, listen carefully. If you hear a faint piano drifting across the fog, don't follow the sound. Don't search for the source, because the music isn't for you. It's for the keeper who went mad, and for the wife whose song never ends. The Smalls Lighthouse Tragedy, Wales, 1801. Far off the coast of Wales, where the Irish sea churns with violent tempests, lies a jagged reef known as the Smalls. Upon this lonely outcrop, a wooden lighthouse was built in the late 1700s. It was meant to protect ships from the treacherous rocks. But in 1801, the Smalls became the stage for one of the strangest and most terrifying tragedies in maritime history. This is the story of two men trapped together in isolation, a story of madness, paranoia, and a body that would not stay silent. Two keepers on the rock. At the time, the lighthouse was manned by two men, Thomas Griffith, a seasoned keeper in his 40s, and Thomas Howell, younger and stronger, but known for his quick temper. The two men disliked each other intensely. Arguments broke out over chores, over food, over the endless loneliness of the sea. But duty bound them together, for on the Smalls, there was no escape. For months, they kept the light burning, their only contact with the outside world being supply boats that came once a season. Then, in the spring of 1801, tragedy struck. Death in isolation. Keeper Thomas Griffith fell gravely ill. Some say it was from spoiled food. Others claim it was the damp air that ate away at his lungs. Whatever the cause, he weakened quickly. Within weeks, he was dead. For most, this would have been tragedy enough. But for Howell, it became a nightmare. Because if the supply boats returned and found Griffith dead, Howell feared they would accuse him of murder. Rumors of their quarrels had already spread among the seamen on shore. Howell knew suspicion would fall on him instantly. And so, in desperation, Howell decided to keep the body. The coffin of planks. With no coffin and no tools beyond what the lighthouse provided, Howell built a crude box from driftwood and spare planks. He placed Griffith's stiffening body inside and secured it with rope. But the Smalls were unforgiving. Storms rolled in from the Irish Sea, battering the lighthouse. The winds shook the tower. Waves hurled themselves at the wooden legs that held it above the reef. And the coffin did not hold. The ropes snapped. The boards splintered. Soon, the body was exposed, arms jutting stiffly through the broken planks. Howell dragged the coffin outside and lashed it to the gallery railing, thinking the sea air might preserve it until rescue came. But the storms grew worse. The wind caught the corpse and swung it violently, arms flailing in the air as if waving for help. Night after night, Howell listened to the body creak and groan as the coffin twisted on the ropes. He swore it was moving. He swore it was watching him. Madness on the Smalls. Weeks dragged on with no relief. Howell tended the lantern alone, sleepless and half-starved. All the while, the body of Griffith swayed outside the window, his pale face turning toward the light as though demanding its warmth. Howell boarded up the windows so he would not see it, but he could still hear the coffin creaking in the wind. When he closed his eyes, he saw Griffith's corpse standing in the room, dripping with seawater, eyes clouded with death. He began talking to it, first in anger, then in pleading desperation. "Don't look at me like that. You know I didn't kill you. You know." Sailors passing in the distance claimed they saw a man pacing the gallery of the lighthouse, shouting at the sea. Some even swore they saw two figures moving, though only one remained alive. By the time the supply boat finally returned, Howell was barely human. The rescue. When rescuers climbed the ladder into the tower, they found Howell gaunt, his hair wild, his eyes hollow. He was surrounded by filth, his clothes stiff with salt. The lantern had gone out more than once, and his journal was filled with ramblings about Griffith's ghost. Outside, lashed to the gallery, was the broken coffin, its occupant little more than a waterlogged husk, arms still stretched as if reaching for salvation. The sailors recoiled in horror. Howell could not explain himself. He simply muttered again and again. They would have blamed me. They would have said I killed him. Aftermath. Howell was cleared of wrongdoing, but he was never the same. He lived the rest of his life as a broken man, haunted by visions of Griffith's corpse swaying in the storms. The story spread quickly through Wales and beyond. Sailors whispered of the haunted Smalls, of the body that waved endlessly for rescue, and of the man who lost his mind in the company of the dead. The lighthouse itself did not last. In 1861, it was replaced by a sturdier stone tower. But even today, fishermen say that when storms batter the reef, you can sometimes see a shadow on the gallery, a figure standing alone, staring out at the waves. Some say it is Howell, doomed to relive his torment. Others swear it is Griffith, still waving for help that will never come. The Smalls Lighthouse tragedy is more than a tale of death at sea. It is a story of fear, of guilt, and of what happens when men are left alone too long with silence and sorrow. A body lashed to the rail, swinging in the storms. A keeper slowly losing his grip on reality. And a light that should have guided ships to safety, instead becoming a beacon of madness. So if you ever sail near the Smalls on a stormy night, look up at the old lighthouse. And if you see a figure waving to you through the gale, ask yourself, is it a man begging for rescue? Or is it something else entirely, something that never left the reef? The keepers who vanished from Stromness Lighthouse, Scotland, 1900s. On the northern edge of Scotland, where the North Sea collides with the Atlantic in an endless war of waves, lies the rugged Orkney archipelago. The sea there is merciless, filled with reefs, fog, and tempests that swallow ships whole. To guard sailors from its fury, a lighthouse was built near Stromness, perched on cliffs that seemed always to tremble under the weight of the storms. But in the early 1900s, the lighthouse gained a chilling reputation. For one night, the keepers vanished, leaving the tower lit, the fire stoked, and the sea whispering of something that had taken them. This is the story of the Stromness disappearance, a mystery that remains unsolved, a haunting that lingers in the waves, and a silence that speaks louder than screams. A tower in the tempest. The Stromness Lighthouse was a lonely posting. Its stone tower rose from the black cliffs, battered day and night by salt spray and wind. The nearest village lay miles away, and once a keeper was stationed there, he might not see another soul for weeks. Yet, the light was crucial. Hundreds of ships passed through the Pentland Firth every season, and without the beacon, many would crash upon the rocks. In the winter of 1900, 3 men were assigned to the tower. Malcolm Kerr, the principal keeper, steady and disciplined. Ian MacLeod, his young assistant, eager but superstitious. And Donald Fraser, a quiet man with a dark past, who rarely spoke of anything except the sea. They were warned by the locals. The cliffs around Stromness were haunted. Old stories told of drowned sailors climbing the rocks in storms, their hollow eyes glowing in the dark. But the keepers dismissed such tales until the winter deepened. Strange omens. December brought relentless storms. Winds howled like voices in the night. Waves rose higher than the cliffs, slamming into the tower with a force that shook its stones. The men grew weary, their nerves stretched thin by the constant roar. Then came the omens. One morning, Ian found dead seabirds strewn across the gallery. Dozens of them, their bodies broken, as if hurled against the tower by unseen hands. Their eyes were missing, their sockets hollow. Donald refused to touch them. "It's a warning," he muttered. "The sea's hungry." That same night, Malcolm swore he heard knocking on the thick oak door at the base of the tower. But when he opened it, there was only the storm. The men laughed nervously, trying to dismiss the fear. But the lighthouse no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a trap. The final log entries. On the 15th of December, the relief boat was delayed by weather. The keepers were left longer than expected, running low on supplies. The logbook entries grew strange. The sea rises even when the wind is still. Voices in the fog. Donald says they call his name. Lantern flickered tonight, though the oil is full. Ian swears he saw a figure on the cliff. The last entry, written in Malcolm's hand, was the most chilling. The sea is climbing the stairs. The disappearance. When the relief crew finally reached Stromness, they were greeted by silence. The lighthouse door was unlocked. The lantern burned steady in the tower. The table in the quarters was set for a meal that had never been eaten. Bread hard as stone, mugs of ale untouched. But the keepers were gone. Their coats still hung on the pegs. Their boots remained by the door. The logbook lay open, ink smeared by a trembling hand. Search parties scoured the cliffs, calling their names. But there were no bodies, no signs of struggle, no explanation. It was as though the men had stepped out of existence. The theories. Some believed they had been swept away by a rogue wave. But why would all 3 leave the tower at once, in the middle of a storm, without their gear? Others whispered darker tales. Fishermen in Stromness swore they had seen lights moving along the cliffs at night. 3 lanterns swaying in the storm, carried by figures that were not human. One old sailor claimed the men had been claimed by the drowned. He told of ancient spirits that rose from the sea, dragging the living down to join them in their eternal watch beneath the waves. And then there was Donald. Some said he had gone mad, killed the others, and thrown himself into the sea. But if so, where are the bodies? The haunting of Stromness. After the disappearance, new keepers were sent to Stromness. None stayed long. They reported hearing footsteps on the stairs at night, though they were alone in the tower. Doors slammed without wind. Shadows lingered in the lantern room, moving against the glass. Most terrifying of all was the sound of voices. 3 men, speaking in low tones, echoing through the stone walls. Sometimes they argued. Sometimes they called out names. Sometimes they screamed. One keeper fled after a single week, swearing that he had woken to see 3 soaked figures standing at the foot of his bed, their eyes black, their mouths open in silent wails. By the 1920s, Stromness was fully automated. The tower was abandoned to the gulls and the storms. But the villagers still avoid it. Even today, fishermen refuse to sail near it at night. The legend lives on. Locals say that when the weather turns foul, the lighthouse lights itself. Its beam sweeps across the waves, though no one tends it. And sometimes, on the cliffs below, 3 lanterns can be seen swaying in the darkness, moving slowly toward the sea. Others claim that if you stand too close to the tower, you can hear the faint tapping of a logbook being written, though no hand holds the pen. And when the wind howls hardest, some say it carries the words of Malcolm Kerr's final entry. The sea is climbing the stairs. The Stromest lighthouse was built to guard sailors from the dangers of the sea. But perhaps some dangers cannot be guarded against. 3 men vanished, leaving behind a light that still burns in the storm, a meal that was never eaten, and a silence that speaks of something unspeakable. Were they swept away by waves? Did madness consume them? Or did something older, something deeper, come out of the sea to claim them? Whatever the truth, Stromness stands as a warning. Not all lights guide you to safety. Some lead you to places from which you never return. So if you ever see a lighthouse glowing on a stormy night, ask yourself, is it guiding you home or luring you into the dark? The lighthouse of Aniva Bay, Russia's haunted beacon. Far to the east, where Siberia's frozen fingers stretch into the Pacific, lies a place most have never heard of, Aniva Bay, on the island of Sakhalin. Here, in 1939, the Soviets built a towering lighthouse on a jagged sea rock, a structure so remote that reaching it required threading through violent currents and deadly fog. For decades, the lighthouse stood as both a guardian and a prison. Its keepers were cut off from the world, surrounded only by the sea and their own minds. Yet over time, whispers began of madness, disappearances, and something inhuman lurking in the mist. Today, the Aniva Bay Lighthouse is abandoned, but those who dare approach its crumbling shell swear it still breathes, that its halls echo with footsteps that do not belong to the living. This is its story, a fortress at the edge of the world. The Aniva Bay Lighthouse was no ordinary beacon. Rising like a stone spear from the middle of the sea, it was 7 stories tall, equipped with living quarters, storerooms, a radio room, and a massive lantern visible for miles. It was meant to project Soviet power across the Pacific, but to those stationed there, it felt like exile. The sea froze in winter, encasing the tower in ice. In summer, fog rolled in so thick that the horizon vanished, leaving the keepers floating in a world of gray. To reach it, supply boats had to navigate deadly reefs, and often, storms forced them back. Keepers could be stranded for months, surviving on dwindling rations. It was said the only constant sound was the ceaseless moaning of the wind through the tower's cracks. But soon another sound joined it, whispers in the fog. The first reports came in the early 1940s. One keeper, a man named Stepanov, claimed that while tending the lantern during a storm, he heard voices outside the glass. Not the roar of waves, not the howl of wind, but human voices, calling his name, whispering promises, begging him to come down to the rocks. When he told the others, they laughed. But days later, 2 men swore they saw a figure moving in the fog, pacing along the gallery outside. When they rushed to confront it, the figure dissolved into mist. The logbook from that month contains entries that grew increasingly frantic. The fog has faces. They call us to the sea. No sleep. Always footsteps. Stepanov disappeared soon after. His boots were found at the base of the tower. His body was never recovered. The keeper who went mad. In the 1950s, a young keeper named Viktor Mikhailov arrived. He was stoic, determined not to believe the stories. But within months, the isolation broke him. Other keepers reported hearing him muttering to himself in the night, holding long conversations with someone unseen. Sometimes he stood at the gallery railing for hours, staring into the fog. One night, during a storm, Victor smashed every mirror in the tower. When the others tried to stop him, he shouted, "Don't you see them? They come through the reflections. The sea's eyes are watching us." The next morning, Victor was gone. His bed was empty. His journal remained, its final page scrawled with the words, "The sea is inside the walls." The Lighthouse of the Dead. By the 1960s, Aniva Bay Lighthouse was notorious among Soviet sailors. Supply crews dreaded docking there, claiming they felt watched from the tower windows, even when no keepers were stationed. One diver, sent to repair underwater cables, surfaced screaming. He swore he had seen faces beneath the waves, pale, open-mouthed, eyes wide with hunger. The keepers rotated faster now, few lasting more than a season. But the disappearances continued. Some were found drowned, bodies broken on the rocks. Others were never found at all. Their names were scratched into the logbook margins, as if the lighthouse itself kept count. Abandonment. By the 1990s, technology had rendered the keepers unnecessary. The last men stationed at Aniva Bay were evacuated, leaving the tower to the sea. When explorers later entered, they found it in ruin. Rusted beds, broken glass, mold climbing the walls. Yet some things were unsettlingly untouched. On a table in the radio room sat 3 mugs of tea, long dried but still upright. In the lantern chamber, the massive Fresnel lens gleamed as if polished. And on the top floor, carved into the stone by a desperate hand, were words in Russian. They are still here. Modern encounters. Today, the Aniva Bay Lighthouse stands as a decaying relic. But fishermen who pass it keep their distance. They tell of lights flickering in the lantern room at night, though the tower has no power. Some claim they hear Morse code signals crackling from radios, ghostly transmissions that repeat the same word, pomogi, Russian for help. And a few adventurers who dared land there reported the same thing, the overwhelming sense that they were not alone. One man described hearing boots on the metal stairs above him, slow and deliberate. Another swore that as he slept, he felt a hand grip his ankle. But when he lit his lamp, the room was empty. Most chilling of all was the account of a photographer in 2016. He captured images of the gallery at night, only to find, later, that in the fog-shrouded photos, 5 shadowy figures stood side by side, staring out to sea. The legend of Aniva. Locals now call the place the Lighthouse of the Dead. Some believe the restless souls of drowned sailors wander its halls, unable to cross into peace. Others say the fog itself is alive, that the sea around Aniva Bay is not water, but a sentient force that consumes men whole. And there are those who whisper that the Soviets built the lighthouse on something older, an ancient rock where shamans once warned never to tread. A place where the veil between the living and the drowned is paper-thin. The Aniva Bay Lighthouse was meant to be a symbol of strength, a beacon cutting through the endless fog. Instead, it became a tomb. Men vanished. Madness thrived. And the sea, patient and eternal, claimed what was hers. Now the tower stands empty, battered by storms, its windows staring like blind eyes across the water. But if you pass it on a foggy night, beware, because some lights don't guide you home. Some lights are traps. And if you follow the glow of Aniva Bay, you may find yourself answering whispers that call you by name, voices that will never let you go. The Eileen Moore Lighthouse Mystery, Flannan Isles, Scotland, 1900. Off the northwest coast of Scotland lie the Flannan Isles, a cluster of barren rocks battered endlessly by the Atlantic. Fishermen avoid them, claiming they are cursed. Even birds circle warily, refusing to nest on the highest cliffs. In 1899, a new lighthouse was built on Eileen Moor, the largest of the Isles. It was meant to guide ships through the treacherous waters, but within a year, it became the site of one of the most chilling disappearances in maritime history. 3 keepers vanished without a trace. What was left behind raised more questions than answers. This is the story of the Flannan Isles mystery, a tale so strange it has haunted Scotland for more than a century. The Men of the Light. In December 1900, the Eileen Moor Lighthouse was staffed by 3 men. Thomas Marshall, the young assistant, ambitious but nervous. James Duckett, the principal keeper, steady and responsible. Donald MacArthur, the occasional relief man, known for his fiery temper. The 3 had been left on the isle for weeks, braving the winter storms. A 4th man, Joseph Moore, had rotated off duty earlier and was waiting on the mainland for his next shift. The Flannan Isles were desolate. There were no trees, no shelter but the lighthouse itself. Only grass, rock, and the endless screaming of seabirds. The sea was both lifeline and prison. Supply boats rarely came unless the weather allowed. But when Christmas passed without word from the keepers, concern grew. On December 26, 1900, a relief ship was finally dispatched. What they found became legend. The first signs. When the relief boat approached Eileen Moor, the men looked for the customary welcome flag, but none flew. The tower's lantern was dark, its beam extinguished. As the boat drew closer, the landing dock appeared deserted. The supply chest, usually brought down by the keepers, was untouched. Joseph Moore, returning for his shift, volunteered to go ashore first. He would later say the moment his boots touched the island, an overwhelming sense of dread overcame him. The path to the lighthouse was eerily silent. No voices, no movement, just the endless crash of waves below. When Moore unlocked the door and stepped inside, his blood ran cold. Inside the lighthouse was unnervingly intact. The kitchen table was set with plates and cutlery, but the food had long since rotted. Chairs were overturned, as though men had risen suddenly and never returned. 2 sets of oilskin coats were missing from their pegs, but one remained, Donald MacArthur's. This puzzled Moore. No keeper would ever leave the tower without his protective gear, especially in the freezing rain. The clocks had stopped. The beds were unmade, as if abandoned in haste. And in the logbook, the final entries told a story that made the men's blood freeze. The log entries. Thomas Marshall's handwriting grew strange in the last days. December 12th. Severe gale, the worst I have ever seen. Duckett is quiet. MacArthur is crying. December 13th. Storm continues. Men pray. MacArthur, very strange. December 14th. Storm ended. Sea calm. God is over all. But here's the disturbing part. Records show the weather on those days was calm. No storms were reported in the region. So what did Marshall see? The vanishing. The official theory was that the men had gone outside to secure equipment during a sudden storm. Waves struck the western landing, sweeping them away. But there are problems with this. Why would all 3 leave the safety of the tower against regulations? Why was MacArthur's coat left behind? And if they were swept away, why were no bodies ever recovered? The relief crew searched the island. They found ropes torn from their fastenings, dragged into the sea. The western cliffs showed signs of violent waves. But to many, the scene felt staged, as though something more sinister had occurred. The theories. Over the years, countless theories have surfaced. A giant rogue wave claimed them all. Madness drove one man to murder the others before vanishing. Foreign raiders or even spies abducted them. Supernatural forces tied to the cursed, I'll drag them away. Locals lean toward the last. For centuries, the Flannan Isles had been feared. Ancient shepherds who visited the rocks to graze sheep would leave offerings, convinced the islands belonged to the little folk, spirits or fairies who would punish intruders. Some believed the keepers disturbed something ancient. And that December night, it came to collect the ghost stories. Not long after the disappearance, sailors reported strange lights hovering over Eileen Moore. Some said the tower relit itself, its beams sweeping across the sea though no keeper tended it. Others claimed to see 3 men standing on the cliffs, staring out at the waves, only to vanish when approached. Joseph Moore, the man who first entered the tower, refused to speak of it for years. When pressed, he admitted that every night he spent there afterward, he heard voices on the wind, sometimes crying, sometimes laughing, sometimes calling his name. To this day, visitors to the Flannan Isles report the same. The lighthouse today, the Eileen Moore Lighthouse, is now automated, its beams still cutting through the storm. But it is rarely visited. The sea around it remains treacherous, and the island's reputation lingers. Tourists who pass by on boats swear they see figures in the windows, moving from room to room. Photographs show shadows where no one should be. And sometimes, the beam itself seems wrong, too bright, too alive, as though it searches not to guide ships, but to find something lost. The disappearance of the Flannan Isles keepers remains unsolved. 3 men vanished from a locked tower on a barren island, leaving behind a meal, a logbook, and silence. Were they taken by the sea, driven to madness, or claimed by something far older than the lighthouse itself? Whatever the truth, one thing is certain: the light still burns. And sometimes, when the storms rage and the waves climb the cliffs, locals swear they can hear a voice carried on the wind, echoing the final words of the logbook. God is over all. But perhaps, on that cursed island, God was not the only one watching. The tragic end of South Stack Lighthouse, Wales. On the western edge of Wales, where the cliffs of Holy Island rise like jagged teeth above the Irish Sea, stand the South Stack Lighthouse. Built in 1809, its white tower was meant to save sailors from the treacherous rocks below. But for some, the lighthouse brought no safety, only tragedy. Among Wales's oldest seafaring legends is the story of a keeper whose devotion to the light led to madness, death, and a haunting that lingers still. This is the tale of South Stack, the keeper's isolation. South Stack Lighthouse was cut off from the mainland by a violent channel of sea. In the early 1800s, there was no bridge. Keepers crossed by boat or when the water raged, not at all. The men who served there lived like prisoners. Weeks could pass before they saw another face. Provisions often ran low. The roar of the sea never ceased, day or night. Among these men was Jack Jones, a seasoned keeper who had given decades of his life to the light. Stern but faithful, Jack was respected by his peers. Yet, in his final winter, something in him began to unravel. The storm of 1859. In October of 1859, the Royal Charter storm struck Wales. One of the fiercest gales in history. It sank more than 200 ships and claimed 800 lives. South Stack Lighthouse was battered for days. Winds howled through its stones. Waves smashed against the cliffs, throwing spray higher than the tower itself. Jack Jones remained at his post, tending the lamp, refusing to abandon his duty. But as the days dragged on, exhaustion overcame him. He muttered to himself. He paced the stairs at night. He swore he saw faces in the sea spray, pale and twisted, calling his name. And then came the knock on the door. One night, while the storm still raged, Jack heard a pounding at the heavy oak door below. Impossible. No boat could have crossed the channel. No man could stand on those rocks and live. Yet the sound was clear. 3 slow knocks. He descended cautiously, lantern in hand. The door creaked as he opened it. Beyond lay only the storm, wind shrieking, waves clawing at the rocks. But in the lightning's flash, Jack swore he saw a man standing on the causeway, drenched, his face pale as bone. When the light faded, the figure was gone. The keeper's decline. From that night on, Jack was never the same. He told his fellow keepers that the sea was speaking to him, that the drowned sailors of the storm had not found rest. "They're waiting on the rocks," he whispered. "They want me to join them." His health deteriorated quickly. He grew pale, weak, coughing blood into his handkerchief. Yet he refused to leave the lighthouse. When his superiors finally ordered him to return to the mainland, Jack agreed. But as he crossed the treacherous path from the tower to the cliffs, his strength gave out. Witnesses later claimed he collapsed halfway, clutching his chest. Some swear they heard the same 3 knocks echo across the sea as he fell. Jack Jones died on the path to South Stack. The haunting. After his death, the lighthouse gained a reputation for being cursed. Keepers stationed there reported strange phenomena. Knocking on the door at night, though no one stood outside. Footsteps on the stairs, heavy and slow, climbing toward the lantern. The faint sound of weeping, carried on the wind from the causeway. One keeper fled after waking to find Jack Jones himself standing at the foot of his bed, dripping with seawater, his eyes black with sorrow. Another claimed the light extinguished itself one night, though the oil was full. When he checked the wick, he found it wet, not with water, but with salt tears. The bridge and beyond. In 1828, a suspension bridge was built to connect the lighthouse to the mainland. But locals insisted that on stormy nights, the sound of knocking still echoed along the bridge's iron chains. By the 20th century, South Stack was modernized, then automated. Yet the stories continued. Hikers reported seeing a man in an old keeper's uniform walking the cliffs, only for him to vanish in the mist. And tourists who visit the Lighthouse Museum today sometimes hear it, a faint rapping on the heavy oak door, even when it is locked tight. The legend lives. Jack Jones's grave lies in a quiet cemetery nearby, but many believe his spirit never left South Stack. His devotion to the light was so great that even death could not release him. Some say that when storms descend on Holy Island, you can still see him, an old man on the causeway, lantern in hand, staring toward the sea. Others whisper that the knocking will one day call again, and when it does, another keeper will answer the door, and another soul will join the drowned. The South Stack Lighthouse was built to save lives, but it also claimed them. Jack Jones, the faithful keeper, gave everything to his duty, and in return, the sea took him. His story is a reminder of the thin line between devotion and madness, between light and darkness. So if you ever visit South Stack on a stormy night, listen carefully. If you hear 3 knocks on the door, do not open it, because once you answer the sea's call, you may never return.